and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Tony Benn, who died last week, won many polls as Britain's most popular politician, famously beating Margaret Thatcher in one of them. That was a BBC poll in which over 20,000 people took part. That admiration has been reflected in many tributes assessing his life, but not in all. Former Sky anchorman Adam Bolton's obituary was headlined "Ben, that twinkling old poisonous irrelevance," and The Guardian's official two-page obituary managed to call its subject Mr. Zigzag Loon before the end of its first paragraph. It concluded that Ben will be forgotten as a practical politician and a practical political thinker. It's almost as if we were back in the 1970s and 1980s when the press regularly called Ben the most dangerous man in Britain. Today, we're hoping to make a more measured assessment of that rarest of politicians, not only admired by his supporters, but respected by his opponents, who got more radical with age and more popular the older he became. I'm joined by Chris Nynham, who worked closely with Tony Benn in the Stop the War coalition, of which Ben was the president, and by John Hillary from War on Want. We're also joined on Skype by Andrew Slaughter, the Shadow Justice Minister and Labour MP for Hammersmith. But first, let's remind ourselves of Tony Benn at work.
Tony Benn, a member of Britain's Parliament for over 50 years and a cabinet minister for 11, died on Friday at the age of 88. A veteran of the radical left, he was frequently described by left-leaning Brits as the best prime minister we ever had. Despite being a divisive figure, Benn was not only admired by his supporters but respected by his opponents.
I mean, I disagreed with most of what he said, but he was always engaging and interesting, and you were never bored when reading or listening to him. And the country has lost a great campaigner, a great writer, and someone who I'm sure whose words will be followed keenly for many, many years to come.
Born in 1925, he became a pilot during World War II, an experience which left him with profound anti-war views. Views he later spoke about with the eloquence for which he was to become known. As president of the Stop the War coalition, he was also an impassioned defender of civil liberties.
Swedes are trying to get Julian back to Sweden. Now, of course, if he goes back to Sweden, then the Americans will go in and get him extradited back to the United States. And like Bradley Manning, who began this work, he could easily be put in solitary confinement and denied a fair trial. And then the whole WikiLeaks story could be ended and we'd be back to the secrecy that we are protesting against now.
However, Benn was not without critics. Michael Foot, whose subsequent leadership was often challenged by Benn, once said that he was someone not to be trusted. Wilson commented that Benn immatured with age, referring to his increasingly radical politics. Although he left Parliament, as he put it, to be able to do politics, he always remained hopeful of the potential of the Labour Party to bring about social change. In an interview with the Islam Channel presenter John Rees, filmed in February 2013, Benn talked about the dangers of nationalism and about his proudest moments in the history of the Labour Party.
Whereas the history of this country, and I suppose of every country in the world, is of successful campaigns that have made progress. That's how slavery was abolished, how the ban on trade unions was abolished by the Tolpuddle martyrs, how women got the vote. And so it isn't that things will automatically come right, but that if you do campaign, you can win, and that hope that you can win is what makes you proud of what's been achieved.
Flaminia Giambalvo, Islam Channel.
OK, so Chris, what do you make of the press coverage? A lot of it positive, but certainly not all.
I'm surprised. I think it's been extremely mixed. I think there's been a lot of attacks on him, which I really didn't expect. And I think it shows partly how out of touch the media are with public opinion, that this is a man who was widely loved, who inspired affection and enthusiasm wherever he went. And yet the media have spent a lot of time trying to dig out some people who had bad things to say about him, really. And I think it shows that there is in the establishment really quite a lot of hostility towards him and towards all the things he stood for.
Yeah, I mean, John, it's odd to have a politician who, on the ground, so to say, amongst ordinary people, it was very frequent for them to say, oh, well, you know, I don't agree with everything Mr. Benn has to say, but I trust him or I respect him, and that not reflected in the media, really, or not completely reflected.
Yeah, that's right. I think partly it's because he didn't play by the rules. The fact that he wasn't anymore part of that cosy establishment where the media and certain politicians get together, decide on the story. Ben was different from that. He was very much part of the movements against the war, movements for change politically, and he stood with people. And that spooks some of the people in the media, and it certainly spooks the establishment in Whitehall and Westminster.
Andy Slaughter, I mean, you know how difficult it is to make a kind of progressive point in the House of Commons, but Ben did manage that on some absolutely outstanding occasions. I mean, the one that comes to memory most perhaps is the speech that he made in 1992 over the Pitts crisis, but there were many. Hi, Andrew, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm just saying, you know, you found it, you know from first hand what it's like to try and make progressive political points in the House of Commons. Ben did that frequently and effectively, didn't he?
Well, he was. It's almost a cliche to say that he was a great parliamentarian, but the point about Tony Benn is that he was much more than that. So I think he saw all parts of his life and career that, you know, overused phrase, he was a Renaissance man. He was somebody who was in government, who held a very young age, held senior positions in government, who increasingly throughout his life had a profile across the country and in many different communities, was always, long before it became the norm, somebody who spent a huge amount of time with his constituents and was a great parliamentarian as well. That's the thing. Normally when you say somebody is a great parliamentarian as an MP, you mean they spend all their time in the House of Commons. They don't do anything else, but you can say that about Tony Benn.
How difficult is it in the atmosphere of the Commons to make the kind of speech, you know, that Ben made, say, on the 1992 Pitts crisis, which is going completely against the kind of the atmosphere in the House?
Well, there's two elements to that. The first is if you're an individual, which he certainly was, not when he started off. I mean, he's always a member of the Labour movement, always dedicated to what he saw as a socialism within the Labour Party. But nevertheless, he had lots of the enemies. He had lots of people he had rows with within the Labour Party. But so you wouldn't necessarily get full support on your own side. But also, if you're making, if you like, points which are not House of Commons points, which are things which go well beyond the sort of coziness of the House of Commons, then there still is today a sort of an atmosphere that is created by what I advisedly would say is the old boys network, i.e. It mainly comes from the Tories, it mainly comes from that sort of public school background which still dominates a lot on the Tory benches, where, you know, there are certain rules you have to play by, and Tony Benn didn't play by the rules. So it did take a lot of courage to stand up and say what he said.
I mean, Chris, you know, he had that political courage both inside the chamber, as Andrew's suggesting, but outside as well. I mean, that he was prepared to do things that most senior politicians certainly wouldn't do, wasn't he?
I mean, he was a walking affront, really, to the political establishment. That's what I think. And partly, as you say, within the establishment itself. I mean, he took socialism seriously, and so, as you understand from his diaries, when he became a cabinet minister, he basically wanted to set about blocking the IMF and beginning to institute workers' control of some industries. And this is like, hang on a minute, that's not really the rules of the game. But then, as you say, outside of Parliament, he took the movements very, very seriously. And I think, particularly in the last 10 or 12 years, I think one of his, actually, despite what the media says, one of his lasting legacies will be the very subversive idea that real change comes from ordinary people getting organised. And this is something he said time after time in rally after rally.
I mean, John, do you think that some of the kind of hostility to Ben in the media is a kind of reciprocal relationship, because he certainly didn't like the way that the media operated, and on occasion would do things which I don't think I've ever seen any other politician do. I mean, on the appeal for Gaza, when the BBC wouldn't broadcast it, the interview, if you watch it on YouTube now, is still astounding. Where he says, "Well, if you won't do this, I'll do it," and simply started sort of using it as directly as a platform to address the audience.
No, absolutely, and I think that challenge to the BBC was absolutely correct. They had unconscionably refused to broadcast an appeal on behalf of the besieged people of Gaza as white phosphorus was raining down from the skies upon them, the BBC turning its attention elsewhere and saying, we can't come behind that. But it wasn't the only time he did that. I remember in the first Gulf War back in 1991 with Tony Benn on Newsnight, and they were just showing you these missiles coming into Baghdad, being filmed as they went past the BBC crews and then blowing up in the distance. And it turned war and the horrors of war into a spectacle, almost into a voyeuristic spectacle. And Tony Benn said to the BBC, stop broadcasting these images as if it's some sort of game on television. Let's turn back and discuss why it is that those people are being subjected to this horrific bombardment. Let's get the politics back in and get that spectacle out of it. And I think that is a challenge to the BBC. It's not the sort of thing that they're used to hearing. And I think it made them profoundly uncomfortable, which is perhaps behind some of the less than fulsome tributes that we've seen recently.
Andrew, do you think that some of it seems to be some of the coverage, some of the sort of more hostile coverage, seems to be driven by people who were engaged in that battle in the Benn for Deputy campaign on the other side? You know, when sometimes I think you see Shirley Williams or Roy Hattersley or Dennis Healey interviewed in recent days, it's almost as if no time has passed and they're as angry about Tony Benn now as they were decades ago.
Interesting, isn't it? I wonder if Tony should take that as a posthumous compliment to himself. I watched particularly the Newsnight programme on Friday, and I was a bit disgusted by it, really, that these now very elderly people were trying to fight battles of 30 years ago. And don't get me wrong, I was in politics then, as I am now, and they were pretty fierce battles. And Tony Benn, I've written an article about this, was not a secular saint. He equally could take no prisoners in those battles. But as he grew older, you could say he mellowed, or you could say just he reflected, and he wanted to make peace, I think, with his enemies, in inverted commas. And I thought it was just bad form for people to reflect back on those times rather than celebrate somebody who was an outstanding politician of the 20th century going into the 21st century. But I say let's leave it at this. Let's say that he should take it as a compliment, because it shows just how effective he was at the time in rattling the political establishment.
I mean, Chris, in a way, maybe. I mean, Andrew's suggesting there that that Benn had moved on, but his opponents in some way hadn't. Do you think that was easier for him to do because, in fact, he'd found broader and other issues coming up? I mean, I suppose if you were as engaged as he was, even in the miners' strike, never mind about opposition to the Iraq War, perhaps some of your earlier battles, receded in importance even in your own mind.
No, I think that's right. I think he became very, very enthused and empowered by the move he took in, 2001, where he said he's going to leave Parliament to pursue politics. And that was a fantastic thing to do, because I think he re-engaged with mass movements and with popular sentiment in a way that gave him a huge amount of energy and a sense of purpose, really, which was very, very important. But I think there's a deep irony here, actually, in a lot of this coverage, which is that actually the people who are saying that Benn's big problem was that he was unrealistic, he was too innocent, he was too left wing. These people and that he should, back in 1981, it should have been all about facing to the right and building bridges to the right. These people would die to have a tenth of the popular support that Tony Benn has right across the spectrum of the population. People say now he was the home counties socialist, is what people are saying. Now, that may be kind of over-egging the pudding, but nevertheless...
Indeed, the audience for socialism and home counties.
Yeah, exactly. But nevertheless, it is the case. This was a man who put a more and more radical view of how society should be reorganised and how it should be changed. And the more he put it, the more popular he became. And surely there has to be a lesson there for the politicians, the bulk of the politicians in the Labour Party, who are still, after all these years, drawing the conclusion that the only thing you can do, despite austerity, despite war, the only thing you can do is tack to the centre. And I think partly the hostility, it's about the 80s and it's about battles in the past. But I also think they're kind of, in a funny sort of way, trying to repress that insight that was so clearly the legacy of Tony Benn himself.
I mean, that phrase, the famous phrase, which you obviously thought about. In fact, I believe it was actually Caroline, his wife, who suggested that phrase to him, that he would leave Parliament to spend more time on politics. It was clearly a strategic decision, and it kind of came at the same time that Caroline herself became ill. So it was a kind of, he's quite old at this point, and he makes a strategic decision to become a public campaigner rather than to remain in the Commons. I mean, that is, well, let's say it's unusual, if not unique, isn't it?
It's a wonderful breath of fresh air that you could actually see grassroots politics as being where it's at and where you want to finish up your life and where you want your legacy really to remain. But I think for me the thing which perhaps bridged both the parliamentary and the post-parliamentary Benn eras was that he pulled out the deeper meaning of all of these different debates. And he wasn't chasing the next or the last opinion poll. He was actually asking the more profound questions as to what these things meant. So, for example, in the miners' strike, he was the one who drew attention to the use of troops in police uniforms as being something absolutely unique and really crossing over into a boundary which was constitutionally unacceptable. Even on his stuff on Europe, where he moved increasingly to be sceptical of all the powers handed over to the European Commission as an unelected, unaccountable body challenging the constitutional sovereignty and democracy in Britain. These are deeper musings on the day-to-day politics. And I think certainly the spearheading of the whole Stop the War movement was another bit of that. What does it mean for us to go on these imperialist adventures? This isn't the 19th century. It's unacceptable in the 21st century for Britain to be taking part in these things. And that's what people respond to, the depth, the fact that he was speaking at a different level to most politicians.
I mean, Andrew, it was said, and he used to joke himself, that he got more left-wing as he got older. But I just wonder how much that's actually true, because he was pretty left-wing when he was young. And I suppose if there's one core of truth to that, is that he did react very strongly to the experience of government and to the limits that he experienced in government, didn't he?
Yes, I think he did. I think that's one part of it. I think it's partly that politics has moved more to the centre generally. So even if he'd stood still, he would still have seemed
become more left-wing. Yes.
But I think it's also that I think this is quite significant. Given he was nearly 90 when he died, and so he grew up in a very different world. So it's my father's generation world. It was a world which was a much more black and white in terms of class, perhaps, but also absolutely less so in terms of race and religion and issues like that. And unlike many people in his generation, he changed and he adapted to new circumstances. And I think he adapted to the world as he saw it. And what people perceived, I think, possibly as a move to the left, was actually him being rather more in tune with society as it developed in the post-war world than many of his contemporaries were. So that's the way I read him. I said that he's one of the people who made me join the Labour Party, because you could see, he was a senior figure even then, even 30 years ago, but you could see that he was also a breath of fresh air, and that constant reinventing of himself and responding in a positive way to changing circumstances, the way he responded to the Iraq War, the way he responded to things like gay rights and so on, were unusual for people of his generation.
OK, well, we'll have to leave it there for the first half, but after the break, we'll be discussing in more depth the legacy of Tony Benn. So please do rejoin us after the break.